Yes, I'm going to talk about Richard Dawkins' God Delusion. I don't know really why I'm doing this. I'm going to just briefly say something about these books later. But as Jack mentioned, I work for Universities and Colleges Christian Fellowship. I'm a Christian Union staff worker. I work with 5 different places, mostly right in Glasgow City Centre, Strathclyde University, Caledonian University, the RSAMD, Royal Scottish Academy of Music and Drama, and the Glasgow School of Art, as well as Paisley. And my job is basically to go around, make my way around these different Christian unions and support them in any way that I can. So advising them, teaching them, training them, meeting with them one-to-one, some of the leaders, and encouraging them, discipling them in that way. So that's basically what I do, which I'm still, even though I've been in Scotland for, it'll be 5 years in June, I've only just started this job officially not less than a year ago. So I'm still trying to find my feet. I'm not always sure what in the world it is I do every week. All I know is I've been working really hard and I feel really tired. But there's a surprise. There's a lot I'd like to say today, which is not unusual for me. But in a sense, when you hear what I think about the book, it's going to seem a bit surprising that there could be so much to say potentially about this book. And I know that everyone talking and writing about it can only hit upon a few things, because I guess Richard Dawkins, if he hasn't been successful in anything else, has been successful in just throwing out a wide volley of assertions that could be dealt with. And so people are kind of just writing from different angles. You know, Alistair McGrath's book is only 64 pages long, so obviously he doesn't get into everything he possibly could with a 370-odd page book. It's a smallish crowd today for Scottish Library, which kind of suits me because I've done a number of apologetic sort of talks, short 15-20 minute talks with my work at the universities, and I was volunteering helping with universities in the years before I started this job, and with question and answer with students. But this is really cutting my teeth in terms of doing an official sort of lecture type thing that lasts for a little bit longer, which taking up the time won't be hard for me. But I don't want to take up too much time. I really hope that you guys will have, I hope a few people at least will have come already with some questions who've possibly read the book. And I hope that a few things I say will provoke some questions. So I'm going to make it a point to stop in plenty of time to have a lengthy question and answer time. Speaking of which, would somebody be so kind as to tell me when it's 1:30 so I have a clue where I'm at? Just out of curiosity, don't feel bad, don't feel like I'm trying to put you on the spot, but how many have read it? Have read The God Delusion? Okay, a few. I have read it. I'm torn when I think about, you know, that most people haven't read it, whether to recommend it or not. Because on the one hand, it can be quite, or it was for me, just in this one particular sense, quite an encouraging experience, if you like, in the sense that Richard Dawkins is considered a foremost, world-renowned atheist, apologist, if you like, today. And the substance, or just to be blatantly honest, the lack of substance to what he writes in this book was astonishing to me. And in that sense, encouraging only in the sense that it's, well, this is the best they've got, you know. If this is the cutting edge of atheism, I would have to agree with Alistair McGrath's book title, The Twilight of Atheism, I think is what we're experiencing here. On many other levels, it's quite discouraging and annoying and frustrating, but on that level, it could be encouraging to you to read it, just to see what can be thrown at this. But on the other hand, one of the things I'm going to want to say today is talk about ways forward from here. I could almost I didn't give a title for the talk. I could almost title it Beyond Dawkins, because I'd like to see us move beyond such things as whatever this is, I don't even know how to label this. It's a genre all its own. See us move beyond such things. So there might be actually really much better atheistic and non-Christian sort of resources and materials for you to engage with than that. But it being so popular, it might be a good thing to take a crack at it. Just borrow it from somebody. We needn't prolong its bestseller status. It's funny because I'm saying I'm already being a bit harsh with the book, and this is one of the things I want to be careful about, because harsh, it goes way beyond harsh. This book does in what it attacks, and I don't want to pay it back in kind. So on that note, I was asked to do a Bible reading this morning and a prayer. I'd like to read from 1 Peter 3, where we get our classic command to defend our faith, our classic command for apologetics, for doing the work of apologetics, where Peter tells us to be prepared to defend or give an answer for the hope that we have. And this word answer or defend, as most of us will know, is in the Greek apologia, where we get our word apologetics. And it was the word used, for example, in antiquity of Socrates. When he was on trial, he gave his apologia, his defense. And this is what it speaks of, a courtroom defense, in which you can imagine the scenario of laid out evidences and reasons and arguments of various kinds trying to persuade the jury and the judge for a verdict, a favorable verdict that you would like them to give toward what you're talking about. And this is where we're commended. But it's very interesting to see this in its context of what is said around that command here in 1 Peter 3. Not to mention the whole book of 1 Peter, but I'm going to start here. So it's a rather long passage, but I think it's worth looking at. So I'm going to start here in chapter 3, verse 8. Peter says, "Finally, all of you live in harmony with one another. Be sympathetic. Love as brothers. Be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult, but with blessing. Because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. For whoever would love life and see good days and must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from deceitful speech. He must turn from evil and do good. He must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear what they fear. Do not be frightened. But in your hearts, set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you, to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. It is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. For Christ died for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive by the Spirit." And he goes on in the next chapter to talk about having a deep and sincere love for one another, and that if we're insulted because of the name of Christ, then God's Spirit is with us in that, and it's something that He is not far from us in, and that He approves of in us, and that we should suffer in that way with a good conscience toward God. But yeah, so you can see the ethos of respect and not repaying insult for insult, etc., being a peacemaker, love, and other things that surround this command to defend our faith. And I find that a very refreshing contrast to Richard Dawkins' style. I think I've been asked to pray as well, so I'll just pray really quickly here. Father, I love you, and I thank you that you love me. I thank you that you love each person here. I thank you for being so gracious to all of us, and particularly those who have come to know you. Yes, we're very thankful and in awe of you and in awe of your grace that you would reach down to us and wake us up to you and rescue us from our sin and the results of that sin and give us the gift of eternal life. I pray that you would enlighten our minds and our hearts as we think about this subject right now, and help me to say some things that are helpful in that regard. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so my experience of reading this was, as I've already hinted at, painful. Not because he was attacking my faith. I've seen attacks, I've read attacks on the Christian faith before. Probably not enough. I need to read a lot more. And I've heard them in dialogue and so forth. But what was painful for me is that this is my personality. I am a great, great lover of meaty, intellectual, rational argument. It's very enjoyable to me, very pleasurable, and I know that may sound strange to some who find it not enjoyable, but and there was a conspicuous lack of it in this book, and those who have read it or who've heard whatever, feel free to disagree with me and say, well, I found it quite stimulating, and I found these reasons quite persuasive. Fine, we'll talk about that. But for me, I felt that I was reading about 70 pages of it, and it was just abuse. It was just heaping abuse, Moderately entertaining. I'm sure for those who already resonate with what he believes, maybe it was highly entertaining and amusing and fun. But he finally moves into a chapter where just called the arguments for the existence of God, and I thought, here we go. We're going to get into it now, And this is out of the things I've studied in apologetics. Some of the arguments for the existence of God are some of the things I've been most interested in and fascinated by. Oh, and I couldn't have been more let down than his dealing with these arguments that I'll mention a little more later. I can't really call what he did arguing with them. It was more like the fallacy of mockery. Premise one. Theists see design in creation. Premise 2, ha 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 ha. 3, therefore there is no God. Which is about what his argumentation amounted to. But then he gets into what he says is his main argument of the entire book, a chapter, Why There Almost Certainly Is No God. And there was some argumentation. I won't say that it was good argumentation, but there was some argumentation finally after about 150 pages. It was slightly interesting, but far from faith-shaking, and far from seeming to invalidate a lot of reasons I feel that I have for believing in God. And then I thought, oh my goodness me, I've got over 200 pages left and he's done with his main argument. And so he goes on just talking about the roots of religion and how this is brought about psychologically and culturally through various evolutionary mechanisms, which he imagines. He doesn't know for sure. He's just taking a guess at it. The roots of morality, why we're good, how we don't need God to be good. The good book and the changing moral zeitgeist is a chapter where he bashes the Bible and then says, our morals come from the changing atmosphere that we find ourselves living in decade by decade, century by century. And then he has a chapter on why should he be so hostile to religion? Well, it's a great evil in the world today, and it has caused much pain and suffering. And he moves into a specific area that, in the second to last chapter, childhood abuse and the escape from religion, where he sees raising a child with religious beliefs as a form of child abuse more heinous than pedophilia. Interesting. And but he rounds off that chapter with a nice list of biblical sayings that are very nice literature, and so we ought to at least raise children with the Bible as literature. And then a final chapter praising science and how it opens our eyes and helps us see a bigger view of life, and therefore is good or better at consolation and inspiration for our lives than religion is. So that's a bit of a very rough overview of the book, maybe not terribly clear to you, so if you would like to hear more about what he's saying in the book, please do ask. Now, I looked at a number of reviews of this book, and I was very encouraged that I wasn't alone in my assessment of it, in its lack of argument, etc. I'll just try to read just a very few things here. One reviewer in a newspaper says he notes that there's page after page of attacks against any foe Dawkins considers an easy target, and he notes the contempt Dawkins consistently displays for ideas that don't conform to his own. That same reviewer notes that far from being a serious philosophical book, this ill-edited and garrulous diatribe contains just about anything that crosses the author's mind, which I was extremely pleased to hear somebody note that, because I also happen to be a great lover of literature and good writing, and this was amazing for just how he really was saying anything that popped into his head, and I thought, Bantam Press, I mean, like, did they just not bother editing it, besides, making sure the spelling and grammar was right or something, that's normally there's a process that goes on between editors and writers where okay, this is a bit messy, can you straighten this up and whatever, but it doesn't seem like it. But a Marxist literary critic called Terry Eagleton, I don't know if people have heard of him, he's got a book I noticed in Borders that seems to be brand new that's come out about big questions of life, probably a much more fair look at these things than Dawkins' book, mentions that, he says, critics of the most enduring form of popular culture and human history have a moral obligation to confront that case at its most persuasive. Okay, and this is precisely what Dawkins fails to do. He does not take the arguments that he wants to counter and the very belief systems that he wants to undermine with any kind of seriousness whatsoever. He does not, for example, in dealing with arguments for the existence of God, cite one single contemporary, right now, philosopher of religion, academic, at Oxford or anywhere else in the world, which there are many, writing serious philosophical works. And he just deals with his formulation of Aquinas' arguments from the 12th century. And so that's quite disappointing, and I would have to say he's failed to fulfill a moral obligation there. I find that not to be too unkind, but reprehensible on the moral level. That lacks intellectual integrity, which he does right the way through. And McGrath notes that. I thought I had McGrath's quote here. I don't. Okay. Yeah. At one point, Dawkins accuses dyed-in-the-wool faith heads, which is what I am, apparently, of being immune to argument. And one reviewer noted it is hard to test this assumption using the God delusion, since its arguments against belief in God are conspicuous either by their absence or by their invalidity. McGrath mentions it is perhaps his weakest book to date, marred by its excessive reliance on bold assertion and rhetorical flourish, where the issues so clearly demand careful reflection and painstaking analysis. And for me, honestly, it makes the book very, very hard to take seriously, because I'm very used to reading, all these, say, Christian apologetics, where they take such painstaking time to accurately represent their opponents in argument, and very carefully interact with each stage of the argument and cite literature from all around the field and make a good case. Even on a popular level, which is obviously what this is meant to be, there's still true engagement with the other side of the argument that happens in these books, and it's just lacking here. And it's I don't see why I really should be expected actually to take it seriously. But moving on into the God question itself. Okay. I do believe that God is a subject that anybody and everybody can enter into and talk about. I don't follow the Enlightenment in exalting human reason as Lord of all, as it were, and the final standard by which everything is measured. However, I do, as a Christian, believe that reason is a gift, and it's something valuable to us and something we need to exercise along with other tools to find out what the truth is. Now, just starting right there alone, why is it that human beings are capable of reasoning and have this need for reasoning for good mental health and for good community amongst themselves? And I think already, if you just postulate God and the biblical doctrine of, it says in Genesis that we are made in the image of God, that already you have an explanatory framework that makes sense of our experience. Why are we rational creatures? What is that grounded in? Well, we are made in the image of a rational creator. What's wrong with that scenario? Where is the problem there? Where is the logical problem or the lack of rationality? It's actually a very rational framework within which to look at things. Now, saying that I think we all can talk about God, this is what's interesting. I think we all do. I think we're theological creatures, if I could say that. In that everyone actually defines their life position and their worldview on the God question, on whether or not God exists, or what this God is like, or what the divine and the supernatural is like. And that is incredibly interesting and already a huge hint as to, I think, what's going on here. And of course, Dawkins admits that, religion and a religious view of life in terms of thinking there's something beyond this and the divine and so forth is just ubiquitous throughout history and today. And he's left with the position of trying to explain that away, what this pervasive belief that he finds all over the place. And I was reminded when reading Dawkins' book of a favorite quote of mine from C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, where he says, "When I was an atheist, I had to try to persuade myself that most of the human race have always been wrong about the question that mattered to them the most. When I became a Christian, I was able to take a more liberal view." And I've always found that a very amusing comment, but it actually struck me with some gravity in looking at Dawkins' work here. But he does have to assume the whole world is basically just wrong, and he's one of the few who's gotten it right. Now, that doesn't make, I'm not saying that's an argument, I'm saying that's an interesting piece of evidence to look at in terms of the big picture. But Dawkins would probably be happy with the philosopher Walter Kaufman's description of man as the God-intoxicated ape. But that, whatever your views on evolution and everything, that, that's what we find ourselves to be. Soaked in this idea of God and the divine, and of course Dawkins would want to say we are in some sort of drunken stupor from which we need to sober up, but we seem to be incapable of doing so. But now, I believe as a Christian that knowledge of God is innate and intuitive. It's something immediate to us. Okay, I don't think it actually requires us to come up with an argument to know that there is a God. Okay, that's just part of my belief. I'm not saying that if somebody's not a Christian, they have to just accept that on the face of it. But that's one of my assumptions that I come to the game with. Okay, and I believe we are all interacting with this knowledge of God, with God himself in one way or the other. Maybe shoving him away and trying to ignore him, or dealing with him on some other level. However, I also believe there's worth to looking at reasons for whether there is a God or not. Now, what I want to do is read something from the book of Romans that was written by the Apostle Paul. But this requires me to kind of do a long aside here, in that I want to look at this ancient document that was written about 25 years after the death of Jesus by a first century Jew. But bringing up the Bible, I think we need to kind of deal with Dawkins' Bible bashing that he does in his book. And in one of his generous and magnanimous moments, he says, "To be fair, Much of the Bible is not systematically evil, but just plain weird, as you would expect of a chaotically cobbled together anthology of disjointed documents, composed, revised, translated, distorted, and improved by hundreds of anonymous authors, editors, copyists, unknown to us and mostly unknown to each other, spanning 9 centuries. And that's one of his kind comments. But I want to just quickly make the point. I can't get into the big argument of it all, but actually through scholarly work, the science of textual criticism, for example, we can actually work out through the thousands of manuscripts that we have that for example, that this document, Romans, does date back to that time. It's a 1st century document, not 2nd or beyond. It's within 25 years, which is within only 1 generation of the time of Jesus. So this is an early witness to these things. Furthermore, that what Paul wrote is 99% substantially what we have today. Okay? Has not been corrupted over time, because we have so many thousands of manuscripts, we can compare them and see, oh wow, there's just a variation here or there on minor matters. Okay, and I can talk more about that perhaps if that's needed. And furthermore, in the Bible, in the New Testament in particular, there is this incredible ethic of truth that you see affirmed over and over again in the writers. For example, Peter, that I was just reading from, in his 2nd letter, he says, he's writing to them and he says, "Moreover, I will be careful to ensure that you always have a reminder of these things after my decease." So he's saying, I'm going to take care to write something down, or have somebody write something down about Jesus, and etc. And he says, "For we did not follow cunningly devised fables when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of His majesty." And you see this reference to being an eyewitness over and over again in the New Testament. And you hear Paul advising young Timothy and young Titus to make sure they reject fables and myths and make sure they preach the truth. And he makes a sharp distinction there between these things. And there's this, Paul often says things like, "I tell the truth in Christ, I am not lying. My conscience also bearing me witness in the Holy Spirit. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. Now concerning the things which I write to you, indeed, before God I do not lie." Another time he says, "I am speaking the truth in Christ and not lying." I mean, these guys understood truth and lie, and they claimed to be telling the truth. And that was part of the ethic, so that they would, like in Ephesians, Paul says, "Therefore put away lying. Let each one of you speak truth with his neighbor," and many other such commands. And this was part of the ethos. So, there's good reason to believe that what he wrote dates to that early time, and we have that today, and there was this ethos of telling the truth. And one more thing I would mention here is that the famous atheist philosopher Antony Flew, which many of you will have heard in the past couple of years, has moved to a position from atheism to, if you like, a form of theism, believing that there is a God in some sense who got all this going, and this was based on the evidence. And from what I understood, I need to look at this afresh. Actually, this is largely due to intelligent design science. So quite interesting that we're looking at that film today that convinced him, yeah, actually there must be a creator. He, in a conversation with Gary Habermas, another Christian philosopher in the States who is an expert on resurrection evidences, a full-blown scholar who's, he's peer-reviewed in the academic literature, etc., has debated with Antony Flew over the years, because that's what Christians do. He had a conversation with him after, and he said, would you ever see yourself moving to a Christian position? And Antony Flew made comments about what he thought about Christianity. One of the things I really loved that he mentioned was just simply this, that they said, well, the Apostle Paul does have, as he said, a first-rate philosophical mind. Okay? So, for these reasons, I think I'm not being foolish to look into this document and take it a bit seriously. Okay, and what my point I want to make here is that I've taken time to look into these things and continue to do so because that's important to me, and I look into reasons and evidences for what I believe. And see, thank you. Richard Dawkins says that he defines faith as being belief in the absence of evidence, or even, as he says, in the teeth of evidence. And if we see something to the contrary of what we believe, faith is just believing it anyway. Okay? And McGrath and many others have pulled him up on this and said, where do you get this idea? Tell me some theologians and stuff and Christians who constantly affirm this kind of thing in a broad spectrum, and this is what we're all about. We're not. Full stop. Christians are not that way. Most religious people aren't. We value reason in relationship with our faith and evidences. Okay. Romans 1, Paul says, in verse 20. Sorry, I'm starting in verse 19. What may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. And I think that's an amazing language there. The invisible is clearly seen. The invisible God is clearly seen. And he says, what does he mean by that? Being understood by what has been made, as when we say, I see. Okay? And he's saying, in the creation, you see evidence of the Creator. Okay? And it's right there in front of our faces, so that we're without excuse. This word apologia that Peter used for us to defend our faith is a version of that, is being used here when it says without excuse. There's a negative prefix stuck on there in the form of the word, and it's anapologitos. And without an apologetic, without a defense, it's inexcusable, indefensible to not believe and accept God's existence because of his creation. And now, granting that there is a God and that he has made it plain to us, Paul's logic here is impeccable. That would follow. We would be without excuse if God has made it plain to us. And the point I want to make there is that this is, I believe, one of the ways forward that we need to take in talking about God's existence, is that we need to take what our own scriptures say seriously, that if you look at the creation, you will see signs pointing to the Creator, and we need to direct people's attention to the creation and how it points to the Creator. Now, as I knew I would do, although I tried not to, I'm running out of time. So I won't actually, I think, go into, I was going to go into at least one of these arguments, but I'm happy to take the time to do that if you'd like me to in the question and answer time. But the one I wanted to look into was what's called the cosmological argument, asking why is there something instead of nothing, and realizing that something cannot come from nothing. And if the universe came to be, then it needs a cause for coming into being. And there's something bigger and greater than space and time and matter that caused the universe. And I can go into that hopefully in greater detail if that were needed. But there's also questions about morality. Where does it come from? Richard Dawkins is so keen to say that we don't need God to be good. Okay, nobody is saying, number one, that you have to be a Christian or a theist to know, to sense that there's right and wrong, and then to practice it. Okay? What we're saying is you can't account for that universal morality that we experience without positing the existence of, since we find within us, pressing upon us, as C.S. Lewis says, a moral law. Well, where would that come from but a moral lawgiver that stands outside of the cultures and things? Because, if we're going to be in one culture and judge another and say, you can't exterminate the Jews and attack countries, and so we need to come over here and stop you. Well, we're obviously appealing to a moral standard that's outside of either culture. So it's not culturally defined. And where is that moral law rooted in? A moral lawgiver. And there's also questions of cause in terms of efficient cause, like where do we come from? There's also questions of final cause. Where are we going? What are we made for? And one of one of my favorite arguments in that regard is C.S. Lewis's thoughts on joy, the experience of joy, and as a sense of longing. That's not quite how we normally think of joy. He has a certain way of thinking of it, but a sense of longing and desire that we have, that we find nothing in this life can actually fulfill completely and to the fullest. And if we have other desires that can be fulfilled, like the desire to eat, means even if we don't get the food, there is food somewhere, and we're made to have food. Well, in the same way, if we find in ourselves a desire that needs to be fulfilled, that can't be fulfilled by a human being, by various forms of success in this life, that still leaves us longing for more, well, why can't that desire be met as well? It's not a logical, airtight argument. It's a signpost. It's this is interesting. Could this be pointing us toward God beyond the world? And in terms of that cosmological argument, just to mention that there are a large number of physicists and astrophysicists and so forth that study the cosmos and have come to these conclusions. Christians, atheists, they're just like, what can we do? We're just going to have to admit there's something supernatural going on here, something greater than the universe causing it, etc. And I can read some of those quotes later if you'd like. Now, to wrap up, I'll say that back there in Romans 1, following on from what Paul was saying there, he says, "For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles." And again, the logic is good. If we deny that there is a God and we refuse to thank him, we're not being realistic, are we? We don't see things the way they really are, and that's going to make us foolish, unfortunately, in our thinking and in our living. And I don't say that as a big accusation toward those who don't believe in God, but it's something to think about. And it's hard not to see Dawkins' elaborate attempt at trying to show that there's no need whatsoever, no possibility of even a creator. It's just an elaborate way of saying no thank you to the creator, of refusing to give thanks for this gift of existence. One of the things that Paul says when he's talking to some people in a place called Lystra, you can see it in Acts 14, he mentions to them when he's trying to persuade them to believe in the one true God, he says that God has not left himself without testimony, without a witness. You see, this is another thing saying this creation is a witness, a testimony pointing to its maker. And the thing he cites there is the good things that we experience in life. And he says your crops and your things, and that he fills your hearts with joy because of the food you get to eat and things like this. And the question is, can we acknowledge, is a universe that ends up godless and therefore thankless, is that really rational and sensible, ultimately? I think of G.K. Chesterton, who was an agnostic in the very early 20th century, and he was struggling, as many philosophers have, to figure out whether he and all this was real or not. and he really couldn't quite get his head around that, because philosophers have said, it's not real and so forth. But once he came through a process of reasoning and realized, nope, it's all real, it's here. Existence is real, I'm really here. His immediate reaction was, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you to someone. But who would you say thank you to for the gift of life? You can thank your parents, that's fine. You can thank, but they're not really the ones who made you, who gave you the gift of life. They were part of that process. And you can't thank the skies and anything else, because you only thank persons. So in order to say thank you for the gift of existence, there needs to be a God. Now, okay, what time is it now? Please?
22:12.
Okay, let me try in 5 minutes then to suggest some ways forward before we go into the question and answer. Obviously, I think respect is something that we need to promote in these things, because it's conspicuously lacking in Dawkins' book. I think what would actually really help us out here is to possibly promote some real atheism, and along with that, some real theism, and perhaps I know it's a bit cheeky and radical, but get people to read some Sartre and Nietzsche, and some people that really follow the logical conclusions of an atheistic position to where it leads to the darkness and despair, and that it leads to, rather than this happy-go-lucky borrowing Christian values type atheism that's not really following the logic of what it believes. But regardless, let's have a real argument here, and not just like heaped abusive insults and stuff. Let's get into an intellectual engagement. On that note, I have to say that I have greatly valued reading Alistair McGrath in the past year or so. This is one of my favorite books, The Twilight of Atheism by Alistair McGrath. Very fair-minded and sympathetic to the atheistic cause as he was one. Just a wonderful intellectual history of the idea of atheism. Very readable, but very learned. And I've really enjoyed this. I think this is a good book to recommend to people. There's a paperback for like £8 or £9 at Borders and stuff. But now, having said that, I've also enjoyed reading McGrath's Dawkins' God, where he very carefully takes Dawkins utterly seriously and goes step by step through all of his major books and talks about his own history with. He read The Selfish Gene when it first came out and was asked to even give a reply at Oxford because he had just switched from theology. Well, finished his science degree, PhD, and was moving on to theology, and like, oh, you'd be qualified to answer. He's like, well, I need more time. And 20 odd years later, he's like, okay, I'm ready. I've thought about this long enough. So a careful thinker, and it really helpful in a lot of ways. And the Dawkins Delusion kind of following up, because basically he'd already answered all this. Richard Dawkins has said nothing new in this book, so he'd already answered. So a brief update. Here's what I have a problem with. Now the only issue I would like to take with McGrath is he is so cautious and careful about making truth claims and making arguments that he almost never gets around to making one and making any positive claims. And I don't know those who might have been at the debate whether you sensed that or not, but I certainly did when he debated Peter Atkins. And I think what we need to be careful to do here is to pay attention to what's going on in our audiences or in our dialogues, because I think McGrath has seen that we live in a very postmodern world and people aren't as into argument and they want to hear about emotions. And so he was approaching things that way, but his debate partner was not approaching things in that way. And really, once the question started, many people weren't approaching the question in that way, and I think he would have been better to shift just a wee bit at least and move into some more proper, rational argumentation. I really think that would be helpful. So if anything, I would say, let's try to combine the likes of McGrath with the likes of William Lane Craig, who is very thorough, rational argumentation, laying out all the evidences and giving very good logical reasons for why we believe what we believe. An excellent book, Reasonable Faith, pretty intermediate, but yet readable and enjoyable. So I would say let's have good arguments and make sure. And what I'm saying is make sure we clash, not in the sense of a big fight and quarreling, but in the sense that we actually are hitting each other. Making the arguments are actually connecting and working with each other. Now, another thing I would say actually is I forgot to bring a book today. Let's get people reading the Bible and books about the Bible. Again, a bit odd. Is that a good way to evangelize and to give a defense for our faith? But the reason I say that is because Dawkins is just heaping abuse all over the Bible and pulling out little horror stories here and there and things totally out of context, and has no idea about what the whole story of the Bible is about. And I think we really need to promote our whole story. And why not? I have this recent book put out by IVP called IVP Introduction to the Bible, Stories, Themes, and Interpretation or something. Very readable, just does a quick overview of the whole Bible, of the Old Testament, New Testament, books of the Bible, a few of the critical things and what the big picture is. Very good, I think, for a non-Christian to read. I think they would find it very fascinating and say, and we need to challenge people. You don't know what you're arguing with here until you've taken seriously our story. So may I recommend to you the Gospels. Try reading about Jesus. See what you think. Okay? read this book that tells the whole story of the Bible. I think this is a way forward. On that note, I think that we need to indeed really get Jesus in this debate here, because I think Jesus is our best guide to theism. Now, there's a reason for that, we believe as Christians, because he's actually God himself come amongst us. But I think his world is a God-charged world where coins and weather and birds and all kinds of things are teaching us about God all the time. And he has this incredible connection with God and this moral teaching that he gives based on the existence of God, etc., that I think is just very powerful and very attesting to those who would read it. So I think we need to challenge somebody like Richard Dawkins to deal with Jesus. Okay, and like an example of his kind of mind-boggling failure to deal with the issues is he cites one paper only by a guy that basically says the love your neighbor ethic of early Christians was an in-group mentality, and it was about love your fellow Jew. I mean, how do you even argue with such things when people are... What I mean is, in Leviticus, where it tells us to love our neighbor, it says to take care of the aliens and to love them and care for them. In other words, foreign people that come into your land. Okay? When Jesus said love your neighbor, taking it from Leviticus and saying this is everything, love God and love your neighbor, and somebody said, who's my neighbor? He told them a story that showed that a Samaritan, the most hated person there was for a Jew, was their neighbor, whom they must love. Okay, he's totally missed the point, saying that this was an in-group mentality and it's really not about loving your neighbor and everything. This should not be allowed. Okay, he cannot get away with this. He needs to deal with the real issues and the real things going on there. And so, I think we need to also recommend books that kind of sum up the Christian faith. So a classic, Mere Christianity. I think this is a great foil still very relevant, great foil to the God Delusion. A more modern one, Tom Wright. In the end, I think I'm going to probably sharply disagree with Tom Wright about a bunch of things, but I still think he's a helpful defender of the faith today. Good update almost of the Mere Christianity thing. Another thing I think we need to do. I noticed Jack gave... Okay, this will be the last thing I say, I think. Jack gave me a newspaper article where somebody interviewed William Lane Craig, because for those of you who don't know, he's a philosopher, a professional peer-reviewed philosopher from the States, and he came over here. He has done a whole bunch of work in philosophy of religion, and there's a guy called Alvin Plantinga in the States who kind of opened the floodgates for theism being a respectable intellectual position in the philosophy departments in our times. And William Lane Craig is one of the people who've come along since then and just really fortified that, so that now theism in the academic world is becoming quite respectable, and many people adhere to it. And so we need to encourage our apologists and say, yeah, keep up the good work, because when they do that work in academia and it slowly filters down to the popular culture, it makes our work a lot easier. But anyway, he came and he did a series of debates and lectures down in England. UCCF brought him over and did that. And a guy interviewed him. Do you know who the guy was that interviewed him? Okay, he's some figure within journalism, I think. But and he said this strange, disturbing thing where he basically kind of put out his argument for the existence of God briefly, and had talked about chatting with him and how William Lane Craig told him how he was converted and stuff. And anyway, in the end he mentions a girl who had just recently died of I think a disease, and how for her, she said before she died that just her tragedy helping others deal with life better, I think possibly others with the disease and things like that, what made life worth living for her. And he said basically that, I'll take that over William Lane Craig's arguments any day. And I just thought, wow, this is a couple things going on there. One is that we need to lovingly, gently probe such comments and say, really? That's fine if there's no God and her life is over now after this terrible tragedy of a disease and so forth. And That's all you need. It's just as long as it made a difference in this life, and then we can cease to exist. I'm not so sure that's, we can just settle for that. But on the other hand, what I wanted to say was just that I think we need to take good intellectual arguments like William Lane Craig, etc., and put them together with stuff like what Tom Wright and others are doing, where we say, not only why do we believe what we believe, but what difference does it make to our lives? What are we doing in the world now today that Christianity has made this huge difference, and this is why we live the way we live? Why are we fighting poverty? Why are we participating in the academic world? Why are we participating in the arts? Because we believe Jesus is Lord over all these things, because we believe his resurrection ushered in a time that's coming in the end where all things will be renewed. And so physical life actually matters to God. And things like this. We need to tell people the whole story and show them what it's like to live for Jesus, so they don't miss that this isn't just some intellectual argument. This is about living. So those are some of my thoughts for ways forward. So we probably have maybe 20 minutes, I hope, roughly.
Dan,
yes.
You have had the evidence that the Dawkins book is a bestseller.
Yes.
In the light of the verses that were read at the beginning, how are you to tackle that in a gentle, respectful way?
Oh, I mean, that one really puzzles me. And I've got several theories going about like how this could possibly be the case. The worst case scenario is the British public is just eating this stuff up, okay? And if so, we're in bad shape in the sense, and I don't want to be alarmist or anything, but in the sense that they can't see the hatefulness and bigotry that's being heaped upon religious people, particularly Christians, in something like this, and they feel fine with that. They feel okay. They don't sense any like wrong, and that's a dangerous place to be. It's the same as if they read a book that was hating Muslims or people of dark skin color or something, and just thought, oh, this is grand, That's a terrible place to be. I hope that's not the case. I think Richard Dawkins has a reputation that people bought the book on. I question whether people have actually read it, or how much of it they've read. I can only hope that many people have looked into it a bit and went, oof, that was a bit of a waste of money. Ooh, shocking, wow. And if the reviewers are any indicator, the majority of the reviews I've read have been quite disfavorable or at least iffy. So I hope that the reading public is taking that in as well. The other thing is, though, that we're not always good, and I'm not saying this in an arrogant way, but in our time at reasoning about things. So this can be quite enjoyable. It's very juicy, what I would call juicy and gossipy. It's like tabloid writing. It really is. So, for those who aren't in for a big argument, this will just be fun, in a lot of ways.
But Dan, it encourages the questions. There are things that we cannot understand or explain. Mm-hmm. Dawkins feeds that in the book. How do we Christians deal with that?
Yeah, I'm not... well, okay, to jump to the point maybe of what you're saying, what we need to do is take up something that he says and argue with it and show how he's not... Number one, the best way to start arguing about it is to show how he's not really making an argument. He's making bold assertions. One of the things that I would do, because of what I've thought about, is when he goes through these briefly through these arguments for the existence of God and says this doesn't make any sense. Well, I would say, wait a minute, let's look at that at a more sophisticated level. There's people that have written about this. Let's unpack that. Really, is it totally irrational that because something cannot come from nothing, and we find that astrophysicists and so forth are telling us this universe began, and it can't have, so it hasn't always been here, but something has always been here, because if you can follow me for just a second, if there's from nothing, nothing comes. Think about it. Think about this. If ever there was nothing, there would always be nothing. Because what does nothing do? Nothing. It doesn't do anything. It just isn't. Okay? So the fact that there's something here, here we are, means there's always been something here. That is fascinating. That is awe-inspiring. Okay? Then you have to question, well, what's the thing that's always been here? Is it me? No. Is it the universe? Well, this seems to not be the case. No, the universe has not always been here. So what has always been here? Space and time and matter have not always been in existence. And yet something was in existence that's not space, time, and matter. Supernatural belief suddenly becomes rational. That's a logical step to take. If space and time and matter have not always been here, but something's always been here, then something, because a cause has to be greater than its effect, something greater than space, time, and matter has always been here. Something immaterial in that sense, and non-spatial and timeless and so forth. And if we start talking about how did the universe go from nothing to being something, well, probably our most rational choice is to say the cause chose for it to come into being, which makes it a personal agent, and you're moving into the realm of what Christians believe is God, one who's beyond the universe, who chose for the universe to come into existence. So that's, one way just to take what he says and grapple with it. But I have to say, though, I don't find him to be really provoking thought, in my opinion, and getting people to think life is full of mysteries and there's things we can't answer. He rather takes a very bravado approach of saying, no, we'll eventually answer everything. Now, right at the end of the book, he kind of switches gears. But all up until that, he's like, oh, science is working on it. Science is working on it. He doesn't like mystery, and he doesn't like people appealing to mystery. He says, that's a cop-out. We need to find out, where everything comes from and not stop at some point and say, well, it comes from God and these sorts of things. So I think we're going to have to fight against a little bit his ransacking of mystery. Now, right in the end, he kind of switches gears and goes, we know so little, and because he wants to praise science as a source of inspiration. So, and he's just like, we can't, what we know now versus what we might know in the future could just be mind-boggling and these sorts of things. But in terms of ultimate questions, I don't feel that I feel he's quite coy, as Atkins was and so forth. Atkins said, there's no such thing as why questions.
But you've advocated reasoning for debate.
Yes.
How do we answer, go back onto the original question, how do we answer things we don't understand?
Oh, I see. Okay, could you give me an example?
Prove the reality of God. Demonstrate it.
Yeah. Okay, this is, fine, that's good. Here's where I need to nuance what I'm saying, what I mean and what I don't mean. Okay? What I don't mean is that human reason alone could solve a mystery like that and prove totally, utterly, conclusively there is a God. Okay? What I do mean, however, is that human reason is a very great tool that I think God has given us that can help us move in the direction of thinking that it's more probable that there is a God than that there isn't.
But Dawkins, as a scientist, would reject that.
Would he? It sounds very scientific to me. What's the most probable explanation of what we experience? That's a very scientific way of approaching things. He can say it's not, but that's what scientists do. They hypothesize, and they say, here's an experience, how shall we explain it? What's inference to the best explanation? We experience a world that is finite, that doesn't account for itself. How shall we explain that? Why not let the explanatory buck stop at a certain point beyond the universe and say, this is where it comes from, which is fruitful because that's where modern science came from. People assumed there was a rational plan to it given by a rational planner, and therefore they could search it out. And I think there's plenty of scientists like Alistair McGrath and John Polkinghorne and many, many others who find the God hypothesis incredibly powerful in explanation and fruitful in research.
Could I chip in?
Yes, of course.
If we look at what Peter says in 1 Peter 3, he is challenging us to give a reason for the hope that is within us. And what these scientists are doing is giving a reason for their hope, because their hope means so much to them. Now, do you think that it is possible that what's happened in the Christian world is that our hope has diminished and we are no longer feeling it so strongly, and so we are beaten before they've started.
Mm-hmm.
And that what needs to happen in the Christian church is for a reliving, a re-understanding, starting again of basics, for us to find out exactly what is our hope. That we don't know our material well enough.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Religion, I've heard it say in some places, is 3,000 miles wide and only 1 inch
Mm-hmm.
deep.
Mm-hmm.
That we need to deepen
Yep.
our understanding. This is what we've lost in our generation.
Okay. Yes, I take that point. I would agree. I think I don't mean to place emphasis on reason like to the exclusion of many other things, not least going deep in knowing what we believe, not just why we believe it, but what it is. And so, for instance, recently, I did a talk on, it was Easter Explained, did a talk on the resurrection of Jesus, used 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul lays out the basic case, the historical case for the resurrection. Says there was an empty tomb, there were appearances, it transformed the lives of skeptics like James and persecutors like me, Paul, and disheartened disciples and so forth. And then saying, where does this belief come from? It dates right back to those early years after it happened. Is there enough time for legend to have accrued? No, there's actually not, and most scholars would agree with that now. What are you gonna postulate? Why did they believe Jesus rose from the dead? Explain that. See, you have to reason about it. And if you explain it by trying to use hallucination, etc., these things don't work. You have to, Tom Wright has done a 700-page book called The Resurrection of the Son of God, showing how, in the ancient world, nobody had a category for a man rising to glory in the middle of history. The Jews thought at the end of history there's going to be a big resurrection. So in other words, the disciples did not expect to see Jesus rise from the dead. And to hallucinate, you have to want to see what you hallucinate about. Okay, so I gave him that rational argument, but I also said, but what does this mean? So what? Is this like Jesus' last and final best trick? And so Jesus rose from the dead. If you believe him, you go to heaven. Is that what Christians believe? No. I started to explain it some more and showed them in the rest of 1 Corinthians 15 where he talks about in the end, when the end comes, in the Greek that's telos, and so the goal that we're moving toward. And that there's going to be Jesus is called the first fruits there. So in the ancient times, with the Jews, they would sacrifice the first bits of their crops in the beginning of the harvest season in trust and faith that that full harvest would come in. So Jesus was that first resurrection body to glory, and the full harvest comes later, and that's what we're looking forward to. And Paul's conclusion at the end of the chapter is to say, therefore, don't give up. Your work in the Lord's not in vain. And I said, for Christians, we're not working against the way things are going to be forever. Okay, we actually think death is an enemy, not just part of the cycle and the way things are going to be. But when we work in physiotherapy and, as I said, against poverty and in all these things, we're not working against the way things are going to be. We're working toward what's coming at us in the resurrection of Jesus. We're working for the renewal of the cosmos. We're anticipating that in our lives now. And so it's kind of telling the big story. So I think you can combine like defending rationally what we believe with telling like, so what? Who cares? What are we living for? Why do we live? And get people thinking about it in a big picture way like that.
Dan, could I say something? And what else would I say? Could you, as this is something to do with Francis Schaeffer today, wasn't that what he rediscovered in his experience in the hayloft and everything that came forth from it? What else was saying we should get back to the discovery of, he had a rediscovery. Yeah. Now, when he came out at first, a big lot of Christians, well, either didn't understand the thing or were against the thing, and even some today fine Christian people will speak against what you're saying because they'll bring in the mystique and say, but the Holy Spirit has got to do it. Yeah. Now that, I think we've come through a long way, and because of all the things that have happened the last 50 years and so on, but I think this is part of it, that the church was in that position. It was anti-rational anyway. And I would think Barth had a lot to do with that.
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing, and this is why I've brought up the rationality and so forth and said I think I'd like to see us marry things together and stop keeping things separate. Okay, I'm not saying let's get hyper-rational and let's only do reason. Please don't misunderstand me as saying that. I'm saying let's make sure we include reason as a gift from God in everything that we are as Christians, whether we're just trying to understand our faith, whether we're sharing it with other people, etc. Let's not pretend as if that's no help at all, almost like reason came with the fall or something, and now it's the enemy of the tool of the enemy or something. No, far from it. God is a rational God. He's beyond human rationality, but it doesn't mean he's less than human rationality somehow. He's greater than it. And one of the things that McGrath does bring up as a positive statement, and he points to John Polkinghorne's work and others, is that explicability itself needs an explanation. That is, why is the universe so understandable? No, there's many things we don't understand, but why is it we can look into the laws of physics and make predictions, etc.? Why? Why do we understand that? You know, that demands an explanation, a full, final explanation, not just, well, you know, the evolutionary processes did this, that, and the other. No. But why? Why is it there at all? And Polkinghorne and others would want to argue our reason and the rationality of the whole scope of things is grounded in a capital R rationality, God. And that's a good explanatory hypothesis.
Can I just add one other thing? You notice I slipped out there. I found it's forget the name's gone again. I'll come back to that.
Okay. Alison?
Dan, you mentioned there about morality and the basis of having, you know, our morality being grounded, as it were, in something outside of culture and everything. How does Dawkins, you know, Dawkins obviously has this idea that we have this selfish gene, but we should have sort of transcended. How does he explain his morality, or indeed any morality, without reference to an absolute?
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons it's hard to grapple with Dawkins is, as I said, and you would just have to read it for yourself to see what I'm saying. There's not really any argument going on, so it's very hard to follow what he's saying. It's fine as in terms of like anecdotes and stuff, you know, if you're not. But once you have to say, well, what does he believe and why? You're like, oh, well, it's a bit tricky. I mean, he just kind of throws a bunch of stuff at you. You know, there's no clear line of reasoning, so he throws up things like, you know, it's a millions of years process that we've been going through as the species that has various sort of moral instincts had survival value, you know, like being nice to those people in your clan, you know, would promote your clan, you know, or your family, and you wouldn't die as easily if you stuck together and that sort of thing. And that's where, you know, friendship and loyalty and stuff like that comes from, or whatever. Which is just a total hypothesis without, I don't know if there's any, you know, experimental data that you can throw at that and like test it and work with it and stuff. It's just an idea. But he would say that, and then he would say, you know, there's the moral zeitgeist, the spirit of our times that defines morality in every era, if you like. And he said, you know, 100 years ago, most people in Britain, let's say, would have been racist, so he says. And for example, he cites T.H. Huxley, who was called Darwin's bulldog, you know, that he really aggressively promoted Darwin's evolutionary theory, and he was utterly racist. and there's quotes, you know, from him saying, you know, that, you know, the black people in Africa can't compete with our big brains, and if it's a contest between, you know, brains using our minds versus biting each other, well, we'll win, and stuff like that, you know, and you know, and worse things than that, and like things about, you know, even like exterminating them and stuff, you know, and just crazy stuff. You know, he says, you know, and T.H. Huxley was in the vanguard, you know, at that time, you know, but now we look at that and we cringe because the moral zeitgeist has changed, you know, and I guess there's some kind of progress assumed there. But a couple things about that are, one person pointed out that T.H. Huxley in that sense was far from the vanguard. The vanguard was the Christian abolitionists at that time, you know, trying to abolish slavery and so forth. They would be the enlightened ones, the people moving on from culture and so forth. But the problem with the idea of progress and morals, when we talk about that assumes some kind of standard that we're progressing toward, and that we could regress away from. You know, without a true moral standard outside of everything, you've got no Martin Luther King Jr. fighting for rights, because he goes against his culture. He goes against the moral zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, which we're saying, no, this is fine, let's keep the segregation and so forth. So just to even work for moral progress assumes a moral standard. And then we get into questions of why, and we need to press these. Why is there, it's not good enough just, and why are we so coy all of a sudden about answers when they seem to lead toward the infinite? You know what I mean? Like we love answers all the time and we want to figure everything out and study it academically, but all of a sudden when we go, the biggest questions, why is there morality at all? What could that be grounded in? It doesn't matter, let's just be good. We don't need God, let's just be good. Well, wait a minute, why did you suddenly become coy about finding out answers? If you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, I was going to say something related to that, because he says that we can be good without God.
Yeah.
But what about the fact that if we turn away from God as a society, we become less good? And then if there's a revival, people's lifestyles change. That's nothing to do with us as innate human beings. That's something that God's doing.
Again, I think we need to share with people our story, the big story, and what we believe. And that's the thing I would say, that nobody is saying that you can't be an atheist and still do good things and know that there's morality. What we are saying is you don't have a rational explanation of where morality comes from unless you posit God. But a further thing we could say is, but yeah, don't you find it hard to be good? Don't you find that you might need some help? Don't you find that you just might even need some rescue from how bad you are? You know what I mean? We need to challenge the society with that as well, instead of all this easy, breezy, oh yeah, we're good. Whoa, really? Are we? Are we so good? And have we progressed so much? That's very questionable. And we all struggle deeply with these things. I mean, C.S. Lewis, when he's using the moral argument in Mere Christianity, winds up one major portion of it saying, look, so we've come to this conclusion. There's two basic facts that are the basis of all good reasoning about the universe. One, there's a moral law that we find pressing in on us. Two, we fail to keep it. It consistently fails. So. Okay.
Yeah.
Is that